Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today on topics in Indian philosophy and, I guess, comparativeness research with some work in analytic philosophy primarily. That's what I'm going to be doing. So I just want to give a little background to how I'm going to proceed today. Hopefully you, I mean, if you didn't, that's okay, but I did give a paper to Kate, and if you had a chance to look over part of that, or at least some of it, or all of it, that would be great. And that paper contains one whole thread of what I want to talk about today. However, because I sent you that paper, and the second part of my talk is not at all in that paper, the PowerPoint presentation will only be on the part that's not in the paper. So I'm going to be assuming that whatever questions you have for me about the paper, you're just going to give me from the paper, and I can off the top of my head recall what I said and talk to you about that. But the PowerPoint will not reference the paper at all, and it will talk about a topic that is adjacent, that is next to this topic. And for some of you who have some knowledge of philosophy of mind and Indian philosophy, you're going to see the connection between why I want to talk about these two topics in conjunction, because one topic in the paper is primarily about this issue about self-knowledge and the subject-object dichotomy. And the PowerPoint is going to be about concepts of consciousness and its relationship to the self and the subject-object dichotomy. So that's the connection between the two parts. I am happy to take questions only on this PowerPoint, on the paper, whatever you want, and we'll let the conversation go from there. I will try to leave most time for questions because you have the paper, and I'll keep this PowerPoint sort of crisp and to the point about just what is this second part of my paper. Okay? Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me again, and let's get on our way. So the goal of this portion of my work is to compare two kinds of consciousness distinguished in Indian philosophy with two kinds of consciousness discussed in analytic philosophy. And just as I say that, I want to make something very clear. When you compare research in analytic philosophy of mind with research in the phenomenological tradition, you will find that there are distinctions in phenomenology that analytic philosophers do not pay attention to. And there are some distinctions in analytic philosophy that people in phenomenology don't particularly care for or pay attention to. So I am not leaving phenomenology out because I don't like phenomenology. In fact, I like phenomenology a lot. It's just that in the purpose of writing this paper, I've decided to focus on this relationship between Indian philosophy and contemporary work in analytic philosophy of mind. And so if you have questions based on phenomenology, I'm happy to take them. But remember, I'm not an expert in like the particular interpretations of Edmund Husserl and Heidegger, but I'm very familiar with what they have to say in this area. So the goal is to just compare these two concepts. I'll present a distinction that is very well known in cognitive science and analytic philosophy of mind. It's the distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. And then I will compare that by presenting the distinction between dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness found in Indian philosophy. And then what I will do is I will argue / suggest that we should consider crossing these distinctions. So far in the research that is out there, you can see people talking about dual and non-dual in Indian philosophy, and you can see people talking about access and phenomenal in analytic philosophy. And I'm suggesting that we should cross the two. I will then, after crossing the two, briefly suggest that an interesting sort of almost wild result occurs. This kind of like result is kind of interesting and weird. I'm not advocating for its truth. I'm just saying it's an interesting result that happens if you take this crossing of the two distinctions. But the main goal is to suggest that we need to take in contemporary research in cognitive science and philosophy of mind we need to take seriously the distinction in Indian philosophy just as much as we take seriously the distinction in analytic philosophy. That's the goal. Okay, so let me begin. So the point of departure for my talk is a paper that was written in 1995 by a philosopher named Anand Dj, who teaches at New York University and is well regarded as one of the leading philosophers of mind in the world right now. He wrote a paper in 1995, and it was called On a Confusion About a Function of Consciousness. And this paper has had a tremendous influence in philosophy of mind. It is cited numerous times by a number of people, and it's anthologized in all of the major anthologies, and it gets a lot of discussion, and it's taught almost in every analytic philosophy of mind course. Everyone begins by discussing this paper and how profound it is. So at the very outset of Ned Block's paper, he says, the concept of consciousness is a hybrid, or better, a mongrel concept. The word consciousness connotes a number of different concepts and denotes a number of different phenomena. We reason about consciousness using some premises that apply to one of the phenomena that fall under the concept of consciousness, other premises that apply to other consciousness, and we end up in trouble. So what he's basically trying to say is that there is this discussion and debate in philosophy about the nature of consciousness. Unfortunately, that concept is not clear. There are many different types of consciousness that we need to talk about. And when we don't separate out these two different things, or three different things, or four different things, we make mistakes when we reason about what's going on with consciousness. That's basically what he wants to do. Okay, so he argues in his paper that there are syndromes of the mind, like these are like abnormal forms of mental cognition, such as blind sight. That's the main one, which I'll describe. Syndromes of the mind, such as blind sight, can be explained through a distinction between two concepts of consciousness. So we ought to separate these two concepts of consciousness out. So what is he doing? He's saying, I want to look at abnormal cognition, what happens when the brain is damaged, or what happens when someone has a mental syndrome. And I want to say, when we look at those phenomena, those aberrant phenomena, we are in a position then to say there is more than one concept of consciousness that we need to separate out. That's the main structure of what he's trying to do. Okay, so I don't know if many of you know what blind sight is, but I thought I would go over it anyway. So patients with damage in primary visual cortex typically have blind areas in their visual fields. If the experimenter flashes a stimulus in one of these blind areas and asks the patient what he saw, the patient answers nothing. The striking phenomenon is that some, but not all of these patients are able to guess reliably about certain features of the stimulus, features having to do with motion, location, direction, for example, whether a grid is horizontal or vertical. In guessing, they are able to discriminate some simple forms. If they are asked to grasp an object in the blind field, which they cannot see, they can shape their hands in a way appropriate to grasping it. And there are some signs of color discrimination. It is interesting that visual acuity, as measured, for example, by how fine a grating can be detected, increases further from where the patient is looking in blind sight, the opposite of normal sight. So just to clarify, this is a really advanced phenomena in some cases. When I teach this in my class, I usually talk about the example where a person is brought to a hallway where there are a number of objects in the hallway. And then what happens is they ask the subject, can they see down the hallway? And the subject says, I can't see anything. So they're saying, I can't see anything in the blind side of my visual field. And then they say, go walk down the hallway. And the person says, I can't see anything. And they say, come on, just try. And they very clearly walk through the hallway, walking around all the objects in their path, making no mistakes. Now, this doesn't always happen, but for many subjects, it happens reliably enough. So the same thing happens. There is a cup in the blind side of their right visual field, and the person is asked, pick up whatever you see. And the person says, I don't see anything. And they're like, just try and pick something up. And they perfectly reach over and grab the cup. Okay, so that's called blind sight. It's a well-documented phenomenon, and it's studied a lot in cognitive neuroscience. So the argument is something like this. In blind sight, the subjects report that they see nothing. If we take the report at face value, then something is missing. We should take what they say at face value. Some sense of consciousness is relevant to what is missing. Seems like some part of consciousness is missing, given that the report is that the subject sees nothing. So consciousness, in some sense, is missing in cases of blind sight. So this is the classic. So basically, let me just summarize very quickly since you missed the slides. So in the phenomenon of blind sight, what's going on is that the person says they can't see anything, okay, in the blind side of their field. Suppose it's the right side, okay? Then we give them a task. We say, walk down the hallway. And then they say, I can't see anything. How can I walk down the hallway? Then we say, just try. And then they perfectly navigate around all the obstacles without bumping into anything. Or we say, pick up something in front of you. And they say, I can't see anything in front of me. And then we say to them, just try. And they perfectly reach out and grab the cup in front of them. So in blind sight, what's happening is the person is saying they don't see anything. But then when we ask them to act, they act as if they could see perfectly. Got it? So their action, their ability to act, doesn't seem to be compromised by the fact that they can't see. So now the question becomes, but something seems to be missing. If we take what they say seriously, and as we say, okay, they're really telling us the truth that they can't see anything, then it seems like they can act in a certain way without seeing. But usually seeing for normal sighted people, not blind people, is correlated with your action potential. Okay, so that's what's going on. Can you see the next slide? Good. Okay, good. So Ned Block says, look, it looks like there's a problem here. It looks like what's going on is that there are multiple concepts of consciousness, and someone has led us down the path of thinking that there's just like this one concept of consciousness. So then he wants to say, where did we get this mistake from? How did we inherit this mistake of thinking that there is one kind of consciousness and that's all there is? And he points to the philosopher John Searle, who some of you may have heard of, who used to teach at Berkeley. And he points to a definition that John Searle gave many years ago in the early 90s. So Searle says, by consciousness, I simply mean those subjective states of awareness or sentience that begin when one wakes in the morning and continue throughout the period that one is awake until one falls into a dreamless sleep, into a coma, or dies, or is otherwise, as they say, unconscious. So he says Searle's definition is extremely wide. It's basically just saying whatever's going on when you're awake is this thing that we call consciousness, and then whatever is gone in dreamless sleep and coma and death is, or when you're unconscious, that's basically what consciousness is. They're just pointing to this phenomenon and not giving a precise enough definition. And so Ned Block's work is focused on the idea of trying to show that this definition of consciousness is too wide, that there must be more than one thing underneath it. Does everyone understand that? Following? There's more than one concept of consciousness that is embedded in Searle's definition. Okay, so he goes on then to define a distinction between phenomenal versus access consciousness. So that's the first thing I want to make clear and talk about. So he draws a distinction between two kinds of consciousness. He says phenomenal consciousness is experience. What makes a state phenomenally consciousness is that there is something it is like to be in that state. Okay, so the notion of there being something it's like to be in that state is tied to another philosopher named Thomas Nagel. So Thomas Nagel wrote a paper in the late 70s called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It's a very famous paper. And in that paper, he tried to articulate the notion of the subjectivity of experience in terms of the qualia that you have by talking about this notion of what it's like. And if you studied phenomenology, phenomenologists have already been aware of this for like eons, something new under the sun. But basically, Bloch is going to say there's one type of consciousness that correlates with this what it's like thing. And now there's another type of consciousness. A perceptual state is access consciousness, roughly speaking, if its content, what is represented by the perceptual state, is processed via that information processing system. That is, if its content gets to the executive system, whereby it can be used to control reasoning and behavior. Okay, so this is the first initial definition that he gives in the paper. And the basic idea is phenomenal consciousness goes with what it's like, and access consciousness goes with content that can be used to do something. Okay, content that can be used to do something. So what he's saying is that Cyril's definition is not taking apart those two types of consciousness. It's saying that those are the same thing. And he wants to start to separate that and show that the separation is important to understanding what consciousness has as a function. Okay. Now, later in the paper, he goes into much more detail about what he means. So I really want to make sure that you understand the initial definitions that he gave. So we're going to go through his distinction. So P consciousness means phenomenal consciousness, and A consciousness means access consciousness. That's the way those terms are used in contemporary literature nowadays. People say P consciousness and A consciousness. So again, P consciousness is experience. P conscious properties are experiential ones. You experience them. P conscious states are experiential. That is, a state is P conscious if it has experiential properties. The totality of the experiential properties of a state are what it's like to have it. Moving from synonyms to examples, we have P conscious states where when we see, hear, smell, taste, and have pains. P conscious properties include the experiential properties of sensations, feelings, and perceptions, but I would also include thoughts, desires, and emotions. A feature of P consciousness that is often missed is that differences in intentional content often make a P conscious difference. What it's like to hear a sound coming from the left differs from what it's like to hear a sound coming from the right. So the core idea here is that whenever you experience something, there's a what it's like. So the way people commonly talk about this is by doing contrast. What it's like to see red is not the same as what it's like to see blue. What it's like to taste curry is not what it's like to taste borscht. What it's like to hear in the left ear, a C sharp, is not what it's like to hear F flat in the right ear. What it's like to run a marathon is not what it's like to swim in the ocean, right? So there's a contrast case. And so the idea is the what it's like in the experiential properties can be captured by contrasting, right? And so we're going to say whenever there's a contrast in what it's like, there's a difference in the phenomenal properties, the P properties, okay? That's the distinction there. Okay. A consciousness, access consciousness. A state is access consciousness, access conscious, if in virtue of one's having the state, a representation of its content is 1, inferentially promiscuous, that is, poised for use as a premise in reasoning, 2, poised for rational control of action, and 3, poised for rational control of speech. I will speak of both states and their contents as a-conscious. These 3 conditions are together sufficient, but not all necessary. I regard 3 as not necessary and not independent of the others, because I want to allow that non-linguistic animals, for example, chimps, have a-conscious states. I say a-consciousness as I see a-consciousness as a cluster concept in which 3, roughly reportability, is the element of the cluster with the smallest weight, though 3 is often the best practical guide to a-consciousness. Okay, so what's the idea here? An a-conscious state, a state is a-conscious when you can use it to think about something, you can use it to guide your action in walking or picking, grasping, identifying, or you can use it to control your speech, right? So the core idea is that access consciousness is the availability of the content to be used, right? So the idea that in one where it says inferentially promiscuous, what that means is that the content can be used to make inferences either inductively or deductively or abductively, right? So sometimes what I like to say to people when I'm sort of just initially characterizing this is that access consciousness is a lot about guiding action in a rational way. And phenomenal consciousness is a lot about what it's like to be in a state, like what it's like to see red versus what it's like to act with respect to red, right? Suppose red, like in America, is oftentimes the color of a stop sign, okay? There's something it's like to see the red consciously, phenomenally, what it's like to see red, and there's something that it's like, there's something that one does when one sees a red stop sign, right? Okay, so you might think that seeing the red stop sign must be correlated with stopping at a stop sign, okay, right? Seeing the redness and understanding it is connected to stopping at the stop sign, right? So the stopping at the stop sign is acting in accordance with what is represented, but the phenomenal state is, seeing the red. Got it? Okay, so that's the distinction. Let's go. So he actually does a good job in his 1995 paper, if you've never read it before, talking about things. But one of the main points he wants to make is that people have a fallacious pattern of reasoning. What they think is blind sight patients lack P consciousness of stimuli in the blind field. So blind sight patients lack A consciousness with respect to stimuli in the blind field. Okay. So I want to say two things here to be careful. One, there is some controversy about exactly what is the correct interpretation of the blind sight case. The interpretation I'm going to give here on the face of it is not exactly the one Bloch gives, but it will help us understand the value of the distinction, which I think now will become clear. A blind sight patient lacks phenomenal consciousness, but that does not mean that a blind sight patient must lack every sense of access consciousness. Got it? Because the blind sight patient can walk down the hallway, the blind sight patient can grasp the cup, the blind sight patient can pick up a pen, but the blind sight patient keeps saying, I can't see anything, I can't see anything. So when the blind sight patient says, I can't see anything, what are they telling us? They're telling us that there is no phenomenal consciousness, right? Because the seeing aspect that we talk about when we say we see things, we're talking about what it's like. We're talking about, when I say I don't see anything, I'm not necessarily saying I can't act with respect to something. I'm saying I don't have any phenomenology. I don't see the red, right? So one interpretation of this work done by Bloch is that blind sight patients that lack P consciousness might not lack A consciousness, okay? Strictly speaking, to be fair to Ned Bloch's actual paper, I will point out that one thing he says is that they could lack A consciousness also, and here's the reason why. Notice that when we ask the subject to do something, they say, I can't see anything, so I can't do anything. So it's not until we kind of nudge them and say, hey, go ahead and try, that they try to do something. It's until we say, guess what's in front of you, or guess what you can pick up, or try to do something. Notice that we don't get any action out of the subject unless we push them in the psychological experiment. So in some sense, the distinction between P consciousness and A consciousness, to say that they are A conscious in some sense, requires a special definition of what A consciousness is. And this point I'm making now is going to be extremely important very soon, okay? So I just want to make sure you understand this. The fallacy is that people infer from failure of P consciousness to failure of A consciousness. And the question is, how should we define A consciousness, okay? Because it looks like we could say they also don't have A consciousness, because they don't do anything unless we nudge them. But then we might want to say, well, even independently of nudging them, maybe there's a way in which they're still A-conscious, but they clearly lack the P-conscious. That's the thing. We want to separate out these two things. All right, let's continue. Good. There's some noise coming from someone. Should we mute them?
Fix it.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, so now let's just get some more terms out there, and I'll take questions on these terms if you want them after. But these are the terms. So P consciousness is phenomenal. There's something it's like. A consciousness is representational, right? So A consciousness represents that something's out there. The other one, A consciousness is a functional notion. Functional notion means that it's multiply realizable across different structures, right? So if something is a functional notion, that means that it can be implemented in different ways. Like, for example, a computer can be implemented in both, a Mac and on an Apple. An Apple and a Microsoft. So you can have two different IBM. You can have two different computers. So functional notions are multiply realizable. So A consciousness is a system relative notion, and P consciousness is not a system relative notion, right? P consciousness is not a functional notion, right? Finally, there is, with respect to P consciousness, a type or kind of state. So the way people say this is that whenever you're P conscious, whenever you're in a P, it's essential that you have certain what it's like things. It's essential to seeing red that redness is there, right? It's essential to seeing red that redness is there, right? The redness is the essential property. Pains are essentially hurtful. It's weird to say that it's a pain, but it's not hurtful in some way, okay? So P consciousness has this essential typing with respect to the phenomenology of the state. A consciousness, by contrast, is not that way. What is accessible at one point in time might not be accessible at another point in time. A consciousness comes and goes, but P consciousness, whenever you have it, it has that phenomenal property along with it. Got it? Okay. Okay. So now comes the important part of his paper, which is the question, can these things occur without one another? Can you have A consciousness without P consciousness? And can you have P consciousness without A consciousness? Got it? So the first one, A consciousness without P consciousness. He gives two examples. One is called a complete zombie, but you can just call it a robot, basically saying, consider a silicon robot whose silicon architecture does not support phenomenal consciousness, but who has the ability for rationally guided action. So if you believe that phenomenology must be realized in a system that is wet, like has a biology, octopus biology, human biology, but it's wet, it's not silicon based, then you might think that you can build an artificially intelligent system / a robot that can do lots of different things. Maybe it even has artificial general intelligence, but it won't have phenomenal consciousness. That would be a case of access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. So arguably one of the biggest debates in artificial intelligence is whether or not there will ever be artificially intelligent creatures that have phenomenal consciousness, right? That's one of the biggest questions that people are asking. And he's basically saying that doesn't preclude them from having access consciousness, right? Because access consciousness is separable from phenomenal consciousness. Another one is what he calls a super blind sight person. So consider a super blind sight subject who has the ability to identify things in the blind field, but reports that there is nothing it is like to see in the blind field. Okay, so what is this super blind sight person? Let me explain. Remember when I was describing the problem with saying that a blind sight subject has access conscious, I said every time we have to get the subject to act, we have to nudge it. So something external to the subject has to get it to try to do something. So someone might say, no, blind sight subjects don't have access consciousness because they won't act unless prompted. The prompting is a necessary condition to get them to act. So they lack both phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. So Bloch considers another case, call it a super blind subject. A super blind subject is one who has superpowers, not like a superhero, but it's someone who, even though they can't see anything, can still reliably go do things without being prompted. So this subject will go and do things without being prompted. It will turn the corner and say, I don't see anything down the hallway, and without being prompted, it'll just try and walk. And it will, of course, navigate. Because the one that's prompted navigates perfectly fine. This one will just navigate without being prompted. So a super blindsight subject is just a way of saying, I don't need a robot to make my point that you can have A consciousness without P consciousness. I don't need a robot. What I need is just a subject who has blind sight, but doesn't need to be prompted to walk. Got it? That's the key idea, because the prompting is what allows people to say the A consciousness is also gone. So if now we say the subject doesn't need prompting, then basically we can have A consciousness without P consciousness. So two examples. One, the robot, but maybe you don't believe in the possibility of artificial intelligence at the level of artificial general intelligence. So basically he's saying, then just take the blind sight case and make the person do stuff without being prompted, or suppose that the person does stuff without being prompted. Okay, other direction. Now we want to say phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. That's the second direction. So we're separating the two. Remember, the goal is to say John Searle defined consciousness in this wide way, but there are actually two different concepts we need to separate. Now he's going in the other direction to show the other independence relation. So one thing he says is, take any creature you think is phenomenally conscious, such as you, right? You probably believe you're phenomenally conscious, or at least I hope so. So you believe you're phenomenally conscious. Now what he says is, just imagine that you have damage to the visual cortex, or part of the perceptual system in the brain. In particular, he says something very specific, which some people don't know about, but there was a book written by Melvin Goodale in the 90s, which compared the relationship between the ventral stream and the dorsal stream in the brain with respect to visual processing in primates. And basically he's saying, imagine that the dorsal stream is closely related to P consciousness than the ventral stream, so that you have damage to one of them, but not the other. So he's trying to say, how can the brain be damaged such that executive control, the ability to act, is gone, but the phenomenology is there? And the way he does it is by saying, there are two streams that control visual perception, the ventral and the dorsal stream. One of them is strongly connected to phenomenology, and the other one is loosely connected. Break the one that's loosely connected, you'll still have phenomenology, but you'll lose the ability to act, okay? So he's saying, how can you have P consciousness without A consciousness? Go into the brain, take a creature like yourself that you think is phenomenally consciousness, break one of the streams, the stream that's loosely connected to phenomenology, but strongly connected to action, and keep the stream that's strongly connected to phenomenology and loosely connected to action, basically. By doing that, you'll create someone with P consciousness without A consciousness. That's the idea there. Okay, then he gives another example that's a little bit more controversial. A lot of people have sort of not really agreed with him on this, but it's worth thinking about. So I'm just going to include his example. He says, awareness of sound is an example. Suppose you're engaged in an intense conversation, like the one we're having right now. Okay, suppose we're just having this intense conversation. When suddenly, at a certain time, like now, you realize that right outside your window, there is, and has been for some time, a very strong sound, a drill. You know, like one of those drills that makes like a lot of noise when it's breaking up the concrete? Like imagine right now, you just realized that that's going on up the street. You were aware of the noise all along, but only at now are you consciously aware of it. That is, you were P conscious of the noise all along, but at noon you're both P conscious and A conscious of it. So let me go through the example. We're having this discussion, and in the background right now, there's this drill, and it's really loud, okay? But because the conversation is so intense in the foreground, although we can phenomenologically hear the sound in the background, it isn't in the foreground where we can access it to reason and act in accordance with it. So, for example, let's make this example a lot better. Suppose my window to my right is open and the drill sound is really loud, such that over the microphone, you can hear it as I'm talking. So we all are hearing the drill. But then finally, now I go, oh man, this drill is annoying me. And then I go and close the window, right? He's saying that at the first moment, you were phenomenally aware of it, but you didn't have access to do anything with it because it wasn't really in the center of your awareness. Once you brought it into the center of your awareness, then you went to act and close the window. So you were phenomenally conscious of the sound in the background and you were having the intense conversation, but only once it was made access conscious could you then go act in accordance with it. That's kind of the example. I know some people have been like, wait, I don't like this example too much, but you can see the idea he's going for, especially if you study phenomenology. It's the foreground background thing. He's saying phenomenal consciousness will have a foreground background structure. Things in the foreground are things that are access conscious. Things in the background might not be access conscious. When you bring it to the foreground, it becomes access conscious, and then something happens. Does that kind of make sense? An attentional shift? Good. Okay. So that's Ned Block's famous paper from 1995. That's the main discussion. I don't know if any of you have studied this before, but every person who studies analytic philosophy of mind at an undergraduate level and a graduate level will be taught this paper endless number of times. So it's a big distinction, and it does a lot of work. It's cited thousands of times in the literature. Lots of papers have been written on it. However, as I was pointing out when we were discussing it, it's not like it's uncontroversial. Like I already pointed to two controversies. What are we talking about when we say the person has access consciousness, but then you got to nudge them and then they can do something and they don't have access consciousness? What's going on there? So there's another philosopher named Tyler Burge. He is at UCLA. Ned Block is at NYU. And Tyler Burge has critiqued Ned Block's distinction. So what does Tyler Burge say? I'm not going to go through his work. I'm just going to show you that someone is criticizing Ned Block and saying he got it wrong. Okay. So Tyler Burge first points out that access consciousness presupposes phenomenal consciousness. In fact, any kind of consciousness presupposes phenomenal consciousness. I want you to take that first sentence and really keep it in mind, because it's going to be the last slide of my talk again. I'm going to bring this up again. But the idea is that access consciousness is parasitically dependent on phenomenal consciousness. So even though they can separate, so Ned Block is arguing that they separate, Burge is pointing out that you can't have access consciousness ever without phenomenal consciousness. So what if they separate? The fact is one is more fundamental than the other. One is necessary for constructing the other. Number two, access consciousness is not captured correctly by a state being poised for use in rational activity. This is the central debate, number two. That is, what is the proper definition of access consciousness, right? So the idea is, now that we've separated the two, and we agree that there's some phenomenon, blind sight, that we want to account for in cognitive neuroscience, what's the correct way to identify that difference? Okay, that's the second point. Number three, although phenomenal qualities, that is what it's like to see red, what it's like to see blue, what it's like to eat borscht, what it's like to smell curry, are individual in terms of what it's like or to feel or be conscious of them. One may have phenomenal states or events with phenomenal qualities that one is unconscious of. Okay. Thus, phenomenal qualities themselves do not guarantee phenomenal consciousness. This last sentence is the main point. To be phenomenally conscious, phenomenal states or phenomenal qualities must be sensed or felt by the individual subject. So this is the idea that the phenomenal quality can be present, but not sensed. Once the phenomenal quality is sensed, then you're phenomenally conscious of it. It's like saying the smell of the curry that's so enticing is present, and then when you sense it, you're phenomenally conscious of it. Got it? That's the way it's going, right? So it's a model that's basically saying phenomenal properties are floating here, and then you come and sense the phenomenal property, and then you're phenomenally conscious. Okay, So these are three major things. Real quickly, to just make it short. Any kind of consciousness depends on phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is controversial. We need to understand the definition of it, and Ned Block has not correctly defined it. Phenomenal qualities can exist independently of being sensed. They need to be sensed in order for a person to be phenomenally conscious. So this is Tyler Burge, 1997, correcting Block, 1995. Okay, good. So now I've walked you through an important distinction in analytic philosophy of mind, and now I want to turn to Advaita Vedanta. Okay, so my project is to merge discussions of consciousness in analytic philosophy with discussions of it in Indian philosophy. So I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about Advaita Vedanta. That doesn't mean there aren't other Indian traditions like Samkhya or Yoga or Vaisheshika or whatever, you know, that have things to say also. I'm just going to focus here to make it simple. So within the Vedic tradition, that is, in addition to Advaita, of Indian philosophy, there is also a distinction made between two kinds of consciousness. It's called dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness. And there are questions in Vedanta about the relationship between them. So just as Ned Block is exploring P consciousness versus A consciousness, Indian philosophers are exploring the relationship between this thing called dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness. Okay, so what are these things? Okay, so according to the Advaita tradition, and the Advaita tradition is very large. I'm basically working off of Shankara. That's mostly who I'll be talking about, but there are differences amongst other Advaitins, so we have to just put that aside for a moment. Dual consciousness is consciousness in which there is a subject-object structure between the subject that is the knower or the perceiver and the object known or perceived. So dual conscious, the dual means that there's a structure of a subject over an object. Dual consciousness is also potentially intentional consciousness because it has the structure for being directed at something. A subject is directed at an object through an attitude. Okay, so if you're familiar with the work of Brentano, you know, Brentano famously said consciousness is always consciousness of something, and that's what's going on here. So dual consciousness is the kind of consciousness that seems like it makes sense for intentionality, because intentionality is something that has an era, it's directed. Okay, dual consciousness is common to the empirical world, and it is also phenomenal in the sense that our intentional consciousness often comes along with phenomenal properties, right? So when I'm directed at something, there's also something it's like to be directed at that thing. When I'm looking at a white wall, there's something it's like to see the white wall, its whiteness. When I'm looking at a blue wall, I'm directed at a blue wall. There's something it's like to see the blue wall. Good. So Advaita Vedanta, like many phenomenologists, recognizes dual consciousness. In fact, most traditions that study consciousness recognize dual consciousness. This is probably the least controversial kind of aspect of consciousness. But Advaita also says there's non-dual consciousness, okay? So non-dual consciousness does not have a subject-object structure. In a state of non-dual consciousness, there is a collapse of the subject-object structure that is common to ordinary experiences in the empirical world, okay? Now, I want to make a quick comment here, just because Kate is here, and this will be relevant to the point. The way in which an Advaitin talks about the non-dual consciousness as a collapse of the subject-object dichotomy, it's not clear that this is the same kind of thing that occurs when, for example, Merleau-Ponty talks about two hands touching one another, right? It's a very famous example in Intertwining the Chasm, where Merleau-Ponty wants to talk about these interesting experiences. It's not clear that those things. So what Merleau-Ponty is doing, in my opinion, is navigating a similar territory, but it's not the same pathway to that territory. Because in Advaita, the pathway to this territory is a certain kind of meditation and enlightenment. And in Merleau-Ponty, it's about certain experiences and how we analyze them, right? So I just want to point out that this is where I think it's relevant. Also, it's really well known that in the work by Hubert Dreyfus and many of the people in psychology that work on what's known as a flow experience. I don't know if I've studied flow experiences. But in flow experience, people say oftentimes, oh, there's a breakdown of the subject-object dichotomy, and you're one with the soccer ball that you're kicking as you go towards the goal, or you're one with the lightning chess piece you're playing. So this aspect of non-duality in flow experience, also, I'm not so sure that that's what an Advaitin is talking about. So just be careful that phenomenology seems relevant here, but it might not be the same thing that the Advaitin is talking about. Non-dual consciousness, in virtue of lacking subject-object structure, is not suited for intentional consciousness. So in non-dual consciousness, you don't have a necessary condition for intentionality. I think a necessary condition for intentionality is a subject-object structure. Whether that subject-object structure is illusory or real, I don't want to debate that right now. I think it has to be real, not illusory. But the fact is, you need the subject-object structure for intentionality. Nevertheless, many Advaitins say that in non-dual consciousness, you can come to know something, right? There's a common theme in the Enlightenment aspect of Advaita Vedanta. So I like to distinguish between the notion of coming to know in the subject-object sense and coming to know in the realization sense. So the other word is called realization. So in non-dual consciousness, you realize things, and realizing something is not a subject-object relation. It's a different kind of thing. So that's, but again, non-dual consciousness, as far as I'm concerned, and I hope most Advaitins would agree with me, is not suited for intentionality. Non-dual consciousness is often described as pure consciousness and does involve phenomenal consciousness. In the work of Advaita Vedanta philosophers, it lacks all qualities and is pure. So in Indian philosophy, there's a distinction between Nirguna and Saguna, and Ramanuja, who is a Vishishta Advaitin, thinks that there are qualities in the field, and Advaita Shankara does not think there are qualities. And so there's a distinction between the two ways in which we understand, but the Advaitin thinks it's like a pure phenomenal field, okay? So this whole pure phenomenal field is what's in non-dual consciousness, okay? So it's not clear that Shankara or any Advaitin uses the word phenomenal, but in thinking about what they're talking about as pure consciousness, I think in a way it has to be pure phenomenal consciousness. And we're going to get to this point a little bit later on. Okay, so now you're familiar with the distinction, dual versus non-dual. So in the first case, Ned Block, access versus phenomenal. In the second case, dual versus non-dual. Okay, so one of the things that has happened is that in Western philosophy of mind, a lot of people like to talk about access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, but they don't want to talk about dual versus non-dual. And the research project I'm engaged in is in arguing that this is a mistake, right? We should be talking about the Indian distinction just as much as we should be talking about the analytic distinction. And then people say to me, well, the reason why we don't talk about the Indian distinction is, why should I believe that there are any non-dual conscious states? Like, why believe in these things, right? Notice, same question. Why believe there's access consciousness? And then Ned Block gives us an argument. You need access consciousness to describe what's going on with a blindsight case, okay? And now we're asking, why believe in non-dual consciousness? So the first thing to say is that many classical Indian texts in the Vedic tradition and the Upanishads talk about non-dual states. So there's textual evidence. But oftentimes the problem with textual evidence is that people are like, well, who cares what the text says? Are there any people who are experiencing what the text says? I mean, the text could say that pink elephants fly every Thursday, but I don't know, how good of an evidence is that for pink elephants flying every Thursday? So a lot of people say, I don't really believe what these Indian texts say. Okay, fine. That's totally legitimate, right? Textual authority is not the highest sense of evidence that we can have. But it also turns out that there are mystics from various traditions, not just the Indian tradition. I want to make this very clear. There's a very strong aspect of mysticism around the world globally, where people describe something that fits very nicely with the description of non-dual consciousness. In the Indian tradition, the person I'm most often thinking of is Sri Ramakrishna. There's an excellent book about his experiences in non-dual consciousness written by Swami Medananda, in which he goes through and talks about the evidence for these sorts of states. But the idea is that some mystics have these experiences, or they say they have these experiences. Okay, but then again, when I talk to people in conferences, people say, who cares what people say? People could say that pink elephants fly every Thursday. That doesn't mean it's true. So what's the evidence for believing this? Couldn't we just debunk what they're saying? Well, how scientifically plausible is it? So now we're going to go down and explore the arguments for that. Okay. So first thing you need to know is that there might be a difference between the way in which John Searle set up the definition of consciousness in Western philosophy and the way in which it occurs in classical Indian philosophy. And there is a big difference. So notice that John Searle is talking about consciousness as what occurs in waking states and is absent when you're unconscious, dead, a coma, or in a dreamless sleep. Okay. He's saying in all those cases, there is no consciousness. Okay. Now, if I brought a couple of classical Indian philosophers to John Searle's house and asked him, hey, do you guys agree with what John is saying? They're going to say no. Okay. And the reason why is because in some Indian traditions, they believe that the distinction is between subtle and gross consciousness, right? So when you're in a dreamless sleep, you're not unconscious, you have subtle consciousness. When you're awake, you have gross consciousness. So the gross subtle thing is kind of like the fineness of it, right? And so the Vedanta tradition and the Sankhya and the yoga tradition actually give arguments that show that you're conscious in a dreamless sleep. And then they debate the Nyaya tradition about whether or not those arguments show that you could be conscious in a dreamless sleep. But off the bat, if everybody in the Western tradition after the 1990s is starting with John Searle's definition, and John Searle says that when you're in a dreamless sleep, you're not conscious, then there are several Indian traditions that are just going to disagree right away. They're going to say that what's going on is that, in fact, you are conscious in a dreamless sleep. And some traditions will agree with John Searle, such as the Nyaya tradition. There's a very wonderful paper on this topic in contemporary literature by Evan Thompson. It's called Dreamless Sleep, the Embodied Mind and Consciousness, where he shows that we can actually use the research from classical Indian philosophy to improve research in cognitive science and try to study whether or not there's consciousness in dreamless sleep. So this is a very recent paper. I love teaching this paper. I highly recommend reading it. It's a great example that shows how Indian philosophy and the ancient debates can help influence contemporary research in cognitive neuroscience. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to get into a little bit of the argument that we can use to talk about these two things, okay? So first, we're going to talk about something called testimony. So the distinction between A consciousness, access consciousness, and P consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is supported by the testimony of blind sight patients. They say they can't see anything in the blind field. So why do we believe that blind sight patients can't see anything? Because they tell us that. Okay, so there is no relevant epistemic difference between the cases of blind sight patients and mystics with regard to testimony. That is, both of them are telling us something. Therefore, the testimony of mystics can be similarly used to support the distinction between dual and non-dual consciousness. That is, if we're listening to the testimony of a blind sight patient to make a distinction, why can't we listen to the testimony of mystics, right? Like if we're still looking at testimony, okay, so that's the argument. The argument is basically saying, if testimony works in one case, why are you excluding it in the second case? Okay, but there's an objection to that argument, right? This is what a scientist would say. When you say there's no relevant difference, you're wrong. Why? Because in blind sight cases, someone could say, look, I don't just have to listen to what the person is telling me when they say they can't see. And the reason why I don't have to just listen to them is I can investigate their brain and I can show you that their visual cortex is damaged by doing an fMRI scan of their visual cortex in relation to a normal subject's visual cortex. And I can show that some of the gray matter or something is missing. So I can actually show you a brain scan that confirms that the visual cortex is there. But of course, for that argument to work, it must be the case that all and only the visual cortex in the brain is responsible for visual processing, right? That has to be true also. But the basic idea is that there is a difference. What is the additional evidence for the mystics? Is there something going on in the brain of a mystic or elsewhere that we can look at that would help confirm the fact that they say they have non-dual consciousness, right? So the only evidence we have for mystics is that they say, hey, I had this non-dual conscious experience, read my book and I describe it, and Sri Ramakrishna has like thousands of pages on it. But the idea is blindside patients aren't just telling us, we also can investigate their brains. What happens when we investigate the brain of a mystic? Is there some signature, some neural signature that helps us say, hey, that must be a non-dual state of consciousness? More research needs to be done here. Okay, good. Second argument, disagreement. Okay, we should only accept a distinction in consciousness studies concerning different kinds of consciousness if there is consensus amongst scholars on what the distinction is, right? So the idea is, if we're going to say that there are two types of consciousness, then shouldn't we agree as scientists about what that distinction is, okay? There is disagreement about A consciousness and non-dual consciousness, while there is no disagreement about P consciousness and dual consciousness. So while we can accept that there is P consciousness and dual consciousness, we should not accept that there is A consciousness and non-dual consciousness. What is the argument here? The idea is that we should accept things in our scientific theory of consciousness only when the experts have sufficient agreement. We only have agreement on dual consciousness, the subject-object structure, and phenomenal consciousness. But when it comes to access consciousness and non-dual consciousness, there's disagreement. You might ask, what is the disagreement? Okay, well, as I already pointed out, Ned Block initially wrote this paper, Tyler Burge criticized him, and just a couple of years ago, a very famous philosopher from Australian National University, Daniel Stoljar, corrected Tyler Burge and argued for Ned Block's original theory. There is clearly disagreement in the literature about access consciousness. I've even heard some people say, there is no such thing as access consciousness, right? There's only phenomenal consciousness. What are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so in the case of A versus P, we have disagreement. What about in the case of non-dual? Well, in Vedantic philosophy, I think most traditions, Advaita, Vishishta Advaita, Madhva, and all these people, they kind of agree about the existence of non-dual consciousness. But if we go to other Indian traditions like the Nyaya school debates the Vedanta tradition and says, no, you are not conscious in a dreamless sleep, and no, there is no non-dual consciousness. So there's debate in the Indian tradition too, okay? So what is the conclusion that one can draw from this? The conclusion is that if you have a reason to deny accepting non-dual consciousness, you have a reason to deny access consciousness also. It's not really fair to say, I want to study the difference between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, but I don't want to include the distinction between non-dual consciousness and dual consciousness, because there is disagreement in both cases. Why does the disagreement allow you to continue discussing access and phenomenal, but doesn't allow you to discuss dual and non-dual, right? So again, my argument strategy is to say, if this distinction between phenomenal and access is really important, yet debatable, then why can't this other distinction, which is also really important and debatable, be part of the main debate? Got it? That's the idea. Okay, so we might ask, well, why are people introducing the concept of non-dual consciousness? So remember, Ned Block had a reason for saying John Searle was wrong. His reason for saying John Searle was wrong is that he thinks he gets the wrong analysis of blind sight. The idea is that the only way to correctly describe syndromes of the mind like blind sight is to distinguish between phenomenal and access. That's the point of the argument. You might say, well, why does Vedanta include non-dual consciousness? Why do we need that? Well, the obvious answer there is going to be related to nirvana and enlightenment. So basically, the Vedantic tradition thinks that there's something you need to be explained, and that's enlightenment or liberation. And that liberation is best explained through non-dual consciousness. So look, there's both cases of phenomenon. In the case of the cognitive neuroscience / analytic philosophy of mind, it's blind sight. And in the case of Indian philosophy, it's enlightenment and liberation. There's a phenomenon in both cases. And the question is what you posit to explain it. In one case, you posit the distinction between A and P. And in the other case, you posit the distinction between dual and non-dual. So basically, there is a reason why they introduce it. It's not for no random reason. Okay, good. So now I think I've come to the place where I've said, I think that the second distinction, dual versus non-dual, is arguably just as important as the access versus phenomenal. So what might we do that's valuable? Well, here's something that's really interesting. We can cross the distinctions, right? So when we draw two distinctions, it's interesting to cross them and see what happens. So now we have non-dual consciousness and dual consciousness, and we have P and A consciousness. So we can say, is it plausible that there is non-dual phenomenal consciousness? Well, that's exactly what Advaita Vedanta argues for. Is it true that there's dual consciousness that's phenomenal? That's the most common type of consciousness for any person who doesn't have sensory impairment. All of us right now are undergoing dual consciousness with a subject-object structure and a phenomenology. There's something it's like to be on this Zoom call, and it's definitely of a dual structure. So the box dual consciousness, P consciousness is very common, okay? Then we might think, is access consciousness and dual consciousness plausible? Well, that just seems to be the case of the silicon robot, right? That is exactly what Ned Block was pointing to. He was saying that in the case of the silicon robots, you have A consciousness without P consciousness, and it's dual consciousness. They can act and do things, okay? But then there's this interesting one here, which is kind of odd and crazy in a way, which is non-dual consciousness that is not phenomenal, but is only access consciousness. So what would that be? I'm just hypothesizing here. I'm not arguing that it's true. So Block argues that A consciousness without P consciousness occurs in robots whose silicon architecture prohibits P consciousness. In Advaita Vedanta, non-dual consciousness goes along with P consciousness. However, if non-dual consciousness can occur only with A consciousness, then there would be an account of how robots could achieve enlightenment, according to Advaita Vedanta. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but there's this interesting option that happens when you cross these. It sort of gives us an account of saying, can there be something that has non-dual consciousness where it's not based in phenomenology, it's based in access, right? So I'm not saying that that's true. I'm not saying there's any evidence for it. What I'm saying is that when you cross these distinctions, certain things are implausible and certain things are plausible, but definitely you can cross these things and investigate them. Okay, good. So let me just make my conclusion here. So I like to read this quote from Max Planck because it relates to the Tyler Birch quote. Max Planck, the famous physicist, 1918, won the Nobel Prize for quantum theory, says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So I kind of see Max Planck and Tyler Birch agreeing, because Tyler Birch said everything is dependent on phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is a derivative. Any notion of consciousness is derivative from it. And I don't think Max Planck is talking about access consciousness. If I look at this quote from Max Planck, I think he's talking about phenomenal consciousness. Ned Block says, the concept of consciousness is a hybrid, or better, a mongrel concept. The word consciousness connotes a number of different concepts and denotes a number of different phenomena. So Ned Block is now saying there are different kinds of consciousness. That was the starting point for my paper. I'm going to say in conclusion, we should consider including non-dual and dual consciousness alongside access and phenomenal consciousness and a taxonomy of possible states of consciousness. Why? Because I think it makes for a more plausible discussion of the varieties of consciousness. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much for presentation. And
I hope it wasn't too long. I think but I tried to keep it.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so very much. It was very interesting, and as for me, it is really a beautiful construction.
Was it clear? Was it? Were you able
Yes,
to follow everything?
yes.
Did I talk too fast? I'm sorry if I talk too fast. Sometimes I talk too fast.
Okay, you have a presentation, so I think understand mostly.
Okay.
And I think you are doing very important thing that you show that problem of consciousness in traditional analytical philosophy is not full, is not enough. There is not enough terms that can describe this consciousness. So you are trying to enrich this tradition by Indian, for example, philosophical concepts. It is very important, and here I fully agree with you. It's really important because I feel that then they discuss consciousness in traditional terms. They sometimes do not understand what about do they ask. They are trying to ask different aspects, but sometimes they mix it. So, and here we see that you distinguish these important aspects, and I think it is really that is neat. And when you show some background from Indian philosophy, bring it here as a very important experience from this non-dual consciousness. Maybe it is one of concepts they are trying to find in such a philosophy. And when you talk about phenomenology, and I have always feel something about it when about Merleau-Ponty or Husserl, that they close to meditation. It's really a some mystical experience in their work. What they are trying to show, its experience, it goes further rational cognition. It's something more than rational. It's some experience, yes, it maybe can be described in Indian philosophy terms. And what I would like to ask and discuss, and you in your article write something about it, maybe. Sometimes when we talk about consciousness, I feel that we mix two types of questions. There are questions about consciousness as process of cognition. Yes, and when there is subject, there is object, and I cognize, I'm trying to know something about object. It's dual consciousness, yes. It's like epistemological question, yes, the type of cognition, type of knowledge, when we have subject and object, and when we cognize, we should have both of them. We should have both subject, both object, because if you don't have something, there is no cognition. When we know something, I know what I know, the subject and there is object. But another question that also present in the question about consciousness, the question about being of consciousness. What is consciousness in itself as a specific phenomenon? And this question is ontological question. Yes, so what is consciousness in itself? And here I think we go answering this question. We cannot answer this question in subject or subject-object dualism. We trying to find the answer on this question. We're seeking for ontological monism. We try to seek that consciousness in itself, like being, yes, and sometimes, yes, it may be close to Indian concept Atman, that is Brahman, that it is, and maybe I in my works call it onto-gnosiological or onto-epistemological maybe confusion or uncertainty, using also quantum mechanics analogical uncertainty. Yes, there are two close questions, ontological and epistemological, but we should divide it. We should not try to answer both questions in one sentence. We should have answer on epistemological and then should answer on ontological, but we should not try to mix it in one answer. They are close, but they are different.
Okay.
How do you think?
Okay, so I mean, wow, that the last point you made is well, I definitely I've written a paper on that second point you just made, actually. So that's for me, that's a really important question, actually. But I will be honest with you. I think I see it a little bit differently from you. So the part that I see connected with you is there are two different questions, ontological and epistemological. So that part I definitely agree with you on. And I also agree that some of the stuff in Indian philosophy helps us get at the ontological question because it's trying to talk about it in itself. I'm not sure that I wouldn't say that phenomenologists also aren't interested in consciousness in itself, but I mean, I just want to make it clear that I definitely feel that there's a definite separation of the question. However, I have another research project that I'm working on, and I've published several papers in this area, where my argument is kind of works like this. I'll give it to you very quickly. If your ontological theory of consciousness makes it the case that I can't know anything about the world, then your ontological theory of consciousness is wrong. So that's an argument that I'm actually developing and have actually written already one paper on, because I think that, so for example, there's a very big school of thought currently right now in cognitive neuroscience and philosophy of mind. It's called illusionism. Illusionism is the theory of consciousness that says that consciousness is an illusion. According to my theory, illusionism makes it the case that I can't really know anything about the world. So I think illusionism is false, basically. This is the basic argument that I've been working on for about 5 years now and developing different versions of it. And so Keith Frankish is a big philosopher who's an illusionist. Daniel Dennett is kind of an early illusionist, and I'm an anti-illusionist. And my main argument is called the epistemic argument against illusionism. So while I agree with you, Dimitri, is it? Is it Dimitri?
Yes.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with you that there are two different questions. But if your theory of consciousness basically tells me that I can't know anything about the world, then I think that theory of consciousness has got to be wrong. So this is also why I have a problem with Advaita Vedanta. I tend to be more of a proponent of Vishishta Advaita or Nyaya. So I tend to take Indian schools of realism more seriously than Indian schools of illusionism. I think Advaita is not as realistic as Vishishta Advaita. I think Nyaya is more realistic, but I like those two schools. But any theory of consciousness that basically turns out to make knowledge of the external world or my relationship to my environment like pretty much impossible because you're saying everything's an illusion is a problem for me. So again, let me just reiterate. I agree that the questions can be separated and we can answer them separately, right? But then I'm going to make a master argument about integration. And I'm going to say, if the theory basically says I can't know anything, then that's a reason to reject the theory because I do have knowledge. So I take the fact that human beings do know things. I'm an anti-skeptic also. I don't think skepticism makes sense. I think we do know things. And so if your theory of consciousness tells me I can't know anything, in principle, that is, it says in principle I can't know anything, then I can't. So that's, I mean, we don't have to go into that whole debate here right now. I can give another talk in a couple of months on that other paper. But for now, I just want to say I agree with the separation, but my position is that anything that says ontologically that consciousness would lead to me not knowing anything just means that I don't think that that's the right theory. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Piotr, you had a question for a long time. Go on.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very clear and concise. So I have several questions. Two of them concern your presentation, and one of them concerns your paper, actually, the paradox in that paper. So I'll start with your statement that everyone in Western tradition starts with a Searle's definition of consciousness after the year 1990. Okay, when I encounter statements like that, I understand that I am not a part of the Western tradition. So for me as a phenomenologist, the more important distinction the more important definition maybe is Husserl's the basic phenomenological distinction between empirical and transcendental consciousness, or ego, as he names it in Cartesian meditations. So basically, why it is important? Because Husserl says that there is empirical consciousness, my consciousness, your consciousness, the consciousness of a dog, for example, and it is related to my personal awareness, personal experiences, etc. So when Searle tries to, he doesn't define consciousness in that part. He just says that let's name that, and that consciousness. So it's not a philosophical definition. I think that's is also interesting. So then he speaks about consciousness like I'm aware of that, I see that, etc. He talks about empirical consciousness, but there is also transcendental consciousness, and this is very important part of phenomenology because it's something that in a sense precedes empirical consciousness. It's the structure which makes it even possible to distinguish, for example, subject and object. And so, for example, I'm not awake, but at the same time, transcendental consciousness, it exists in a certain way. So it is necessary. It is necessary even to construct a thought of existence, for example. So, have you considered this very important distinction between empirical consciousness and transcendental consciousness?
Yes, I have. So basically, in my department, I mean, just like a couple of years ago, for 30 years, there were two people in my department. One was a leading Husserl scholar. His name is Richard Thiessen. And another one was a leading Merleau-Ponty scholar. His name is Peter Hadrius. And so I definitely take seriously the phenomenological tradition. I am aware of the distinctions in Husserl. So part of my reason for not, I have done some work on Husserl, mostly about his stuff on Idos and knowledge of Idos. And basically, one of the reasons why I don't do a lot of Husserl stuff in my talks is because, and correct me if you disagree, but ideas 1, 2, and 3 are not very easy to read. I mean, I don't think that reading Husserl is very easy. So I read Richard Thiessen's work, and he has very clearly articulated Husserl's position in a way I can understand it. So I can talk about Richard Thiessen's view in these things and tell you what I think about. But when it comes to what Husserl says, you know, I tried to go through like ideas 1 and 2, and I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. This is crazy. I read this other book called Experience and Judgment, and I found that a lot more easy to understand. I am aware of this work, and my colleague in Austria is a Husserl scholar, and I work with him. I personally am more interested in Merleau-Ponty, though. My initial influence in philosophy came when I read this passage from Intertwining the Chasm, the invisible and the visible, about the two hands touching one another. And I just became fascinated with that when I was like 20 years old and decided to become a philosopher. I was originally an oceanographer, actually. I was studying ocean water life. But then I read this passage from Merleau-Ponty, and I was like, dude, this is crazy. So this is awesome. So I tend to understand Merleau-Ponty better. And I do think that, so when we say things like John Searle says this and everybody follows him, you know, it's clearly false. I mean, Hubert Dreyfus lived across the hall from John Searle for 40 years and taught at Berkeley, and he disagreed with everything John said about consciousness, yet, you know, no one read Hubert Dreyfus. And so, yeah, there's this constant phenomenology versus analytics sort of problem about things. My goal is very clear. I have no problem including phenomenology in a larger version of this talk. You know, I'm happy to do that. And There's also the distinction between reflective and pre-reflective consciousness. That's a common distinction, right? Isn't that one of the other distinctions?
Yeah.
It's in there. So it's not like the phenomenologists don't have like 50 different theories of, all sorts of things that are important. But the point is, I'm addressing an audience that wants to believe that the cognitive neuroscience work that's done in addition and combination with analytic philosophy is sort of doing the best work out there. And I'm trying to convince that population that the introduction of these ideas from Indian philosophy and of course from phenomenology. So if you read Evan Thompson's work, who is Evan Thompson influenced by? He's influenced by Husserl. So if you read Mind and Life is basically, a bunch of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and then a bunch of Buddhism, basically. So and some cognitive science. So I studied with Evan Thompson also. I totally agree with the approach. So there's nothing wrong with these things. I have considered them.
Yeah.
They're just not part of this talk yet. Now, one thing I could suggest is that if you're interested in helping me figure this out, I'd be happy to talk with you more about how exactly to include the distinction between transcendental and empirical consciousness. By the way, there is some people who think there's a stronger connection between the phenomenological distinctions and classical Indian philosophy. So for example, even the distinction between empirical and transcendental consciousness might make more sense to Indian philosophers than the distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Strictly speaking, within Indian philosophy, I'm not sure many people will grasp the point of access consciousness unless you explain to them blind sight and what you're trying to do there. So yeah, so I definitely agree. So yes, I did leave out the phenomenologist. I apologize.
I want to precise that this is not like an attack. I just think
No, I
that this
understand that.
distinction
No,
really is
It's
important. Yeah.
It's important. And actually, if you could send me a paper that correctly captures that distinction in a nice way, I'd be happy to include it in this talk because I think it's extremely relevant.
Okay, I can suggest you to read Cartesian meditation.
Yeah, I have that.
It's really, it's a condensed version of late Husserl's views on the subject, and also I think there are some guides like how to read them, etc., in English, and I think there it's pretty clear. Okay, but yeah,
go to your other question.
Yeah, other question. Okay, so I think there is some confusion about like this nature of consciousness thing. For example, you compared the experience of mystics and experience of blind sighted patients. Yeah. So blind sighted patients, their experience, it's the base of their argumentation that we have two, maybe not nature of consciousness, but we have two functions of consciousness. So consciousness can work in different ways. So there is access way of consciousness, and there is phenomenal way of work of consciousness. So, but when you started to explain dual nature position in Indian philosophy, dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness, you stated that the experience of mystics is the experience of non-dual consciousness. But I think that this is not an experience of a certain way of consciousness or a certain nature of consciousness, maybe, but there are experiential states. These states, they are states of a certain kind of experience, and only after our interpretation we can say, okay, this is the base for our theory of dual or non-dual consciousness, and we can reinterpret them. For example, we can say, okay, they state that they don't have subject-object distinction in that state, but it exists. But for example, they just don't have an access to that distinction, subject-object distinction. But it is still there. So the nature of consciousness, it's the same, but we have different types, different ways of consciousness, maybe. So I think this is a terminological commentary, maybe, but I think
No,
this is.
well, my feeling is that it's not terminological. I think it's more. So, right, strictly speaking, Ned Block's paper is about a confusion about two functions of consciousness. So Ned Block is talking about functions of consciousness, and he's talking about certain sorts of diagrams people used to make about how consciousness works and stuff, and what goes in what box in a flow chart and stuff like that. So I definitely get I mean, but you know, functions, concepts, he's definitely trying to distinguish two different things, right? And the point you make there, I'm already familiar with. The point you're making on the other side, though, I think is not terminological, but it's substantial, because what it's trying to say is that there are, I mean, I'll put it this way. There are phenomenal states which don't have a subject-object structure, and there are phenomenal states that do have a subject-object structure. And non-dual consciousness is a phenomenal state which lacks a subject-object structure. Now, when you put it experientially, what in some sense I think you're saying is you're giving the argument about why a consciousness that is non-dual is implausible, which I said in my little box when I crossed them. Why is a consciousness that is non-dual implausible? Because first of all, it's a phenomenal state that's non-dual, not a non-phenomenal state. However, look, I just want to make it clear. It's very clear that the classical Indian philosophers like Advaita Vedanta want the phenomenal state to be one of pure consciousness. So it's like a field without the properties of, it's like pure consciousness, meaning it doesn't have the smell of curry in it and the smell of borscht, and the color red, and the qualities are gone. It's the pure field on which the qualities do, and it lacks the subject-object structure. So in Advaita, it's pure, both in the sense that there's no subject-object structure, but also what is purely realized is something that doesn't have these individual qualitative properties, right? There's no qualitative properties hanging out there. So yes, I think that's right. I don't think it's terminological, but I think the point. So if I was to make what you're saying as a criticism of what I said, I would say it this way. I think, Anand, that you might be confusing the difference between two functions of consciousness and two kinds of phenomenal consciousness, right? So the Indians are talking about two kinds of phenomenal experiences, one that is dual in the empirical world and one that is non-dual in the Atman Brahman collapse state. And what Ned Block is talking about is two functions of consciousness. But even though we use the function, remember, Ned Block did say something clearly. He said access consciousness is a system relative function notion, and phenomenal consciousness is not a system relative functional notion. So in the use of the word function, he actually means something different than functionalism. Otherwise, he couldn't have said that, right? He can't say that access is functional and phenomenal is, he should say something more like this. Phenomenology is doing something to our cognitive lives that's different than what access is doing. That's a better way of putting it, because remember, he still wants to say that access is functional and phenomenal is non-functional, right? So the terminological part of your point that you were getting is that the word function is being used in two ways in Ned Block's work. That is terminological, and that's very important to get clear on the terminology. However, the criticism that you make of my work is that, Anand, the Indian philosophers are talking about two kinds of phenomenal experiences, right? And Ned Block is talking about this notion of function in this other non-functionalist sense. So you're right. I need to think about something there. There is perhaps an error there. Regardless, as of now, my response would be that we ought to still consider the distinctions that the Indian philosophers are making in a comprehensive study of consciousness. That's the point. So I'm basically saying that I don't really see a reason to exclude the Indian contributions to the study of consciousness simply because they're based on testimony and disagreement, right? Because I showed that there's testimony and disagreement in the case of the analytic tradition as well. And by the way, there's testimony and disagreement. Sorry, there's disagreement between Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, Hubert Dreyfus like rails against Husserl. It's like totally into Merleau-Ponty. So I'm not the phenomenologist on the block, but if you're telling me all phenomenologists agree with one another, I was under the impression that Heidegger hates Sartre, and basically Merleau-Ponty and Husserl made a number of errors. I mean, you teach me, I don't know. Okay, you had one more question about my paper, so why don't you go?
Yeah. So in response to a commentary about phenomenologists, I think they have a very special type of disagreement, but that's the subject for another time. So yeah. Okay, so about your paper, what is really interesting is that paradox that you formulate based on Indian philosopher. It's interesting. Okay, so I will read it. First, it is impossible for the self to be both a subject and an object of at the same time. Second, self-knowledge is a necessary condition for all knowledge. And third, we have self-knowledge, where the self is the subject of our knowledge. So we have a contradiction between one, it is impossible for the self to be both a subject and an object at the same time. And three, we have self-knowledge, where the self is the subject of our knowledge. And also two, if there is no possibility for self-knowledge, okay, so we basically have no knowledge at all. But, okay, so the words also, this terminological aspect is really important here. And I know that you can use different terminology, there are different explanations of the same paradox, but unfortunately, I hadn't have a time to read them. So in your case, basically one, it is impossible for the self to be both a subject and an object at the same time. This part at the same time, if we want to be logically consistent, we need to add this at the same time part in two other points. So self-knowledge at the same time is a necessary condition for all knowledge. We have self-knowledge at the same time, where the self is the subject of our knowledge. If we don't have that addition, first point, just it has no relevance to other two, unless we explain it some way. But I didn't find this explanation, this connection in your paper.
Okay, so I think the answer to that question is that the paper I sent you makes reference to a paper I published in 2019 called The Paradox of Egocentricity. And in there, I talk about the temporal issue, synchronic versus diachronic. So there's another paper I wrote that's before this one. But I think there's 2 points you're actually making. So I don't think when you read my other paper, you're going to be satisfied either, because I think what you're saying is that you want the same qualification in every single case. You're basically saying that in order, so there's a debate right now, and that debate is, how do we understand Mukherjee's paradox? And I think what you're pointing out is that Mukherjee's formulation and Garfield and Busham's interpretation will also make a mistake because it doesn't have the at the same time all the way through. And I agree with that. So I'm actually trained as a mathematical logician, so I tend to prefer hyper precision in the logical representation of something. So I agree with you. Like, yeah, and so I can make that change. However, after you read the 2019 paper I wrote called The Paradox of Egocentricity, which is very short, and you see the section that is about time, you can tell me whether you still think I'm making the same mistake. So thank you very much. But I think it's addressed there.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, I also have a certain question and also a short commentary, which I think would be an interesting addition. And I think I will start with a commentary, which is like sort of contribution to this example of super blind side subject, which is one of the possible combinations of subject which has A consciousness but lacks P consciousness. And for me, this is the most problematic case according to net blocks classification, because when he says that we can assume existence of such super blind sight subject who tries to do something but he's or she's not being prompted to grasp some phenomenal experience there. It seems a sort of hard to imagine case, simply because there is a presupposition that still the subject is inside in the world relationship.
Oh, yeah, got it. Yeah, got it.
And I wanted to add as a sort of contribution, an example from Soviet, let's say, dialectic Marxist example. It was an experiment which you maybe know, the Gorski Experiment. Have you heard of it?
Can you describe the experiment? I might not know the title.
I will describe it shortly. This was a pedagogical experiment with a number of children who were trained, and they were blind and deaf and at the same time. So they had very limited perception access to the world. So the gesture training was used, and some of them were like really very small children, like less than school age. So this was presented in the beginning as the triumph of so-called this activity pedagogical method. So that there was a training by putting the periodically repeated gestures, and if there is a possibility that a child can learn using a very simple tool, like a spoon, it means that this child will be capable of learning theoretical concepts and explain them and do some sort of scientific work in future. And in fact, there were examples of those children who has become grown-ups and they finished universities. And at the same time, it was evident that there were two important factors. One, that there was this being prompted, like there was this trainee pushing them into this experience, because otherwise they could simply like remain very calm with no signs of that we could rationally interpret. And the second factor, which was also important, and this was also used as an argument against these people involved, that in fact, these children in their previous experience, they were not born deaf-blind, but they lost their vision and ability to listen to when they were very, very small. Like they could, till 2 years old, they had possibility to see, and then something happened, like they lost it. And most of the good examples, like those who managed to get this higher education, they had this, like they insert, in a way, their brain was a little bit trained in these perceptive things that were not possible to measure at that time, but still it was like the presupposition so that they would be able to develop this, what we would call, according to that block, A consciousness without P consciousness. So maybe this super blind sight subject is sort of problematic in a way.
Yeah, okay, can I just, before I go to the other point, let's just talk about this. So I agree. So this is, okay, so let me just say, there's some things I really want to talk about here, because you talk about this case, it's really relevant. Like so I thought, it's really funny, before yesterday, for over 15 years, I had been teaching the blind sight case, where I basically just assumed that the point of the blind sight case is that you have P consciousness, so you have A consciousness without P consciousness. I just assumed that. Then I decided, before I wrote my lecture notes for here, to reread the paper from 1995, just go back to the original. And literally, in the passage where he describes it, he says, you must realize that in the famous experiment that Marcel did, where they have the cup of water and the patient is thirsty, that he doesn't reach out unless he's prompted to, that it's likely to say he lacks P consciousness and he also lacks A consciousness, right? So it's more like when P consciousness goes, A consciousness goes, but it's not an argument that says P consciousness is gone, but A consciousness is still there. But then when you read the literature afterwards, it seems like there's a theory under which what a consciousness is doesn't mean that it's ready for action, but that it has global broadcast. So there's a theory by Bernard Bars called global workspace theory, and global workspace theory of consciousness influences Ned Block. And then he says, oh, access consciousness is not about being poised for action, it's about being globally broadcasted for use. So that gets rid of the problem about the action thing. But for me, it still makes sense that the most important thing about a consciousness was that a person could act without the phenomenal information. And then you're basically saying, how plausible really is this? I mean, does this distinction really make sense? Which kind of feeds the argument that, in fact, some people just don't believe there is a consciousness without P. There's something going on that's different but tied, and it's not clear what it is. So yeah, so I'll concede right away that the main point of talking about that distinction is to show that although we teach that distinction and we want people to take it seriously, it's highly controversial. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And another question is, in fact, concerning this testimony of mystics, which for me is a very interesting issue, because I'm also like studying some testimonies of Syriac Orthodox mysticists, and these are very interested tractates written on it. But in this case, when we study these testimonies, we face I would not call it a paradox, though it may sound like a paradox, that this non-dual consciousness experience was like evident for someone like a mystic. And then when there is this testimony explanation, it is given in such a form that it is reflected with certain concepts, and in a way it becomes the object for a dual consciousness as reflected one, which is evidently the case whenever we try to explain something. We get back to subject-object mode, which is simple, yes, but there is also this interesting point which Sartre gave on the way we modify the content when we switch the mode. In fact, that he says that with the emotion, this is very evident, because if we take like rage or anger in non-reflective way, it tends to push us to one way of acting. And if this is a reflective rage or reflective anger, it tends as an emotion also to push us, but with this sort of rational control over it, it opens another capacities of our behavior according to this state of emotions, but being reflected as a certain state of emotions. And then we face this interesting case with this multi-layered a consciousness. So the question which I'm posing is that do we need to suppose that there is not only like first, not only dual and non-dual consciousness, but also a certain this reflective bridge?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, I think I know where I think I know. So one of the issues is, I mean, basically, I think you're basically in the neighborhood of what's known as the ineffability paradox, right? So a state is ineffable when no statement or attempt to explain it completely truthfully captures it. And then there are lots of theories about what is ineffable, but you just gave the classic one. I mean, if Sri Ramakrishna is having a non-dual experience and then he tries to write it down in words, well, that's a dual structure. So how the hell is that going to give anybody the experience of what's going on? So there's kind of like this gap between us trying to explain something and the nature of the thing. Like the one school of Indian philosophy that loves to make this point are the Buddhists, because the Buddhists are like, hey, you know what? Concepts come from here, but reality doesn't have concepts. We conceptualize everything and we make them seem like universals when it's a world of particulars. So every time we describe anything, we just falsify the way the world actually is. So yes, so one thing I want to first suggest is that, at least from my position, I'm not so scared of these problems of ineffability. And I'll give you an example. I think there are lots of constructions in mathematics that we understand pretty well, but we know that we're not able to precisely capture them. Infinity is a great example, right? like the difference between R and N, or we understand what the continuity of the successor function is in arithmetic. And that gives us an idea of what infinity is. But can you have the complete thought of infinity? Is a representation of R, the letter R, is that a perfect designator of the cardinality of R? And so I have a tendency to think that understanding can approximate, right, in a sufficient way to give understanding. So I think it's true. If an experience is fundamentally non-dual, then no explanation of it in a dual thing can give its complete nature. But that doesn't mean it can't point us in the right direction, right? Or it can't point us towards something, right? And this is sort of like that thing about the limits of understanding, right? Like how far can you go when things that are non-linguistic have to be represented and explained linguistically? And I agree that there is this problem. So the first part of what you're saying is that, yes, there's a little bit of a problem of explaining non-dual experiences. So someone is testifying. So here's the difference. In blind sight, someone's testimony is in a language that is consistent with the blind sight phenomenon. But in non-dual experience, the testimony is in a language that's the exact opposite of the experience. So the testimony doesn't correlate with the structure of what the person's experiencing. So that's a criticism. So by the way, there are people who work on this. So I have a good friend named Swami Medhananda who just wrote a large book about Swami Ramakrishna and talks about all these arguments and things like this. So ineffability is already a problem in philosophy that people work on. I have some theories about it, but I just want to acknowledge that you're correct, that we might have a reason to think that the testimony of mystics is not as easy to accept because what they're talking about is inconsistent with the language in which they express it. Then the second part of what you were saying is something about, shouldn't we include also these different modes, the reflective versus the non-reflective? And I take that to be a little bit like what Fedor was saying, in the sense that, like, are there distinctions in phenomenology that if we bring into the discussion of analytic and Indian philosophy, we will have a better taxonomy of how we should talk about these? Yes, the answer from my position is yes. I'm less familiar with the distinction between reflective and non-reflective in phenomenology. I'm more familiar with pre-reflective and reflective. Is there a difference? Could you teach me the difference? Is there a difference? Non-reflective just means engaged. Doesn't non-reflective mean engaged? Do you mean the difference between reflective and engaged?
No, it's exactly this Sartrean classical concepts are really, as everything is consciousness for him, then it is pre-reflective and reflective, which modifies the pre-reflective highly.
Okay.
And then there is an attempt to introduce also the non-consciousness inside the attention of phenomenological reflection, which is like a phenomenological unconsciousness, which is a sort of late, more like later notion. For example, in Mark Rishir's work, but this is also sort of problematic because this is like the way he's pointing out to this. In other terms, it could be like the approximation which never reaches the exact grasp in a way, or this is like probably the same thing which is important for Wittgenstein when he said that in logical philosophical tractatus there is unwritten work which is as important or even more important than the written part. Yeah, so maybe this is like the way of being sincere as a philosopher to do this thing.
Yeah, good, thank you. So I definitely agree that the distinction between reflective and non-reflective is relevant here. The part that I'm more familiar with is, how do we understand testimony about something when it's what the testifier is talking about is exact opposite of the nature of it? I'm familiar with that paradox a lot, and I have some things to say about it. Most of what I have to say is that you can understand things in a way that points you in the direction, even if you can't completely grasp it. That's usually what I have to say about those sorts of things. But thank you. Good. You want to go again? Say another one, Kate. You have another one?
I just had a very short comment on this language thing that could. There was a Russian philosopher Bibikhin who was always pointing that when we're trying to somehow understand, maybe not conceptualize theoretical, but understand the way experience reveals itself, then maybe the poetic language shows us those capacities which are much more precise rather than philosophical language, which is basically strictly this subject-object structured.
Yeah, so you're right. So if the idea is that metaphors help us access these things better than logic, I agree with that also. Yes. Yeah. So I think, I agree with that. Good. Thank you. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, questions, comments. Well,
Up to you guys.
probably not, but I'd like to add that if someone will maybe have some additional questions later on, like rethinking today's conversation or the article, you may write down this by email, and I will be glad to provide these questions to Professor Anand. And Fedor, one more commentary.
Yeah, I have one final commentary. Thank you very much for the discussion. So I just happen to have an idea concerning this ineffability question. So really, we have a lot of phenomena which we cannot describe precisely, but we still are using them. And I just understood that actually what we have these precise philosophical construction which have different arguments and different outcomes. It's like really, it's like a construction made of different possible ways of thinking. And then, for example, we cannot express certain feeling. We cannot express a certain experiential state, but this construction, it actually gives us a way of thinking in that direction, even if we cannot actually connect the construction and the experiential phenomena. So it's like the possibility of imagination by Kant. So we can imagine something that we cannot experience. And I think that a lot of our philosophical discussions, they actually are using these out of these experiences and these phenomena that actually exist out of the philosophical field, language field, maybe. And I just thought that this is really interesting.
Cool.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, so one of the things I oftentimes think about this understanding thing is about operations like negation. Like, you know, when I say, look, what I want you to think about is the opposite of this, I wonder how much direction that gives someone in imagination, because we have to recognize that sometimes when you say the opposite of this, or you say the negation of this, there are lots of things that fit on the other side. And so you're pointing, but you might not be precisely capturing the one thing. So there's kind of like this cone of stuff. But yes, I definitely understand. And yes, I am also open to any questions by email. And Kate, anything following up about the article, please let me know. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I really had a great time. I hope to meet all of you at some point in person in Russia and to talk to you more. And if you have anything you want to reach out to me about, I'd be happy to help. So once again, thank you very much and have a good evening. And I hope to talk to you sometime again in the future. Thank you very much.